funds and special accounts. Huge decline in what we have for an ongoing revenue stream versus our spending. And if we reverse that and look at it for every dollar of revenue coming in the door, how much are we trying to spend? You'll notice back in fiscal year 2007, for every dollar coming in the door, we were trying to spend $1.01. Now in fiscal year 2010 original budget, for every dollar coming in the door, we're trying to spend $1.14. Now let me put that in perspective for you. It would be like a family with a $50,000 annual income back in fiscal year 2007 had to put $500 on their charge card in order to balance their budget. Not perfect, but very manageable. Now just 3 short years later, that same family with a $50,000 annual income now has to put $7,000 a year on their charge card in order to balance their budget. We're going the wrong direction and at a very, very fast pace. I find it really interesting as we listen to elected officials today that keep saying no one could see this coming. What I've shown you here on this chart is a couple of quotes from 2008, 2 years ago. This is what the experts were saying about the lag for revenues to hit the states and the depth of the type of recession that we might be entering into. But yet today, we have people out there saying no one could see this coming. The experts were warning us. We chose to ignore the warnings that actually were out there. It's interesting, especially since it was actually in October of 2009 that the governor had to implement 10% across the board cut. That 10% across the board cut was 18 months after the warnings came out. Plus, that's all we've heard over the last 18 months was what the recession looked like. The other interesting thing is everybody talks about a revenue problem. And I want to be clear, there's no doubt about it. We have a revenue problem because of the recession. But what no one talks about is what the federal stimulus package has done for us. What this chart shows you, that first red box shows you when the original budget was adopted for fiscal year 2010, we were dealing with about a $170 million drop in revenue. It's not too bad. Then in October and December, the Revenue Estimating Conference reduced it again by another about $450 million. So total revenue decline is somewhere around $620 million. Everybody talks about that, but no one talks about the federal stimulus package that provided us resources, one-time resources, to replace that lost revenue. And in fact, we got about $530 million from the federal government to replace that. So in other words, for every dollar that we lost in revenue, the federal government gave us 85 cents to replace that. So we're really only facing about a $90 million drop in total resources this fiscal year. But yet, we had to implement almost a $600 million spending cut. Why? Because we never had an ongoing stream of revenue to support that spending. And all those funds that we were tapping, such as the Senior Living Trust Fund, the tobacco settlement funds, were depleted, so we couldn't go back to those one-time funds anymore. So the recession caused us problems, but it simply deepened the challenges that we're facing today. It didn't create the challenges. The sad part is it didn't have to look like this. This shows you if we'd have gone back to fiscal year 2007 and had controlled spending just to the tune of inflation, it would have looked differently. And that's what we did from 1980 to the mid-1990s, made a huge difference. Had we done that, it shows you on that chart that the federal stimulus package would have pretty much wiped out all of our problems in fiscal year 2009 and 2010. In fact, 2010, we've only been facing a $100 million shortfall. Much easier to deal with than a $600 million spending cut. Plus, when you get to fiscal year 2011, we would have had many more options on the table because we wouldn't have taken as much money out of the cash reserve funds. We wouldn't have taken the money out of the Senior Living Trust Fund, out of the tobacco settlement fund. So we would have many more options to deal with as far as this year's budget challenges as they go forward. Now, what do those budget challenges look like? You've probably all heard about the billion-dollar spending gap. Well, this is what it looks like. If you take a look at estimated revenues, we're now down to about $5.4 billion of projected revenues. Iowa has a 99% spending limitation, so it means we can only spend 99% of that number, which brings us down to $5.349 billion. Already in fiscal year 2010, to provide general fund services, we're spending $6.035 billion. So that's after the 10% across the board cut. So that's the reduced spending base that we're going from. Now we have some things for education and Medicaid that are already built in, and if we bring those costs in, it's going to be at least a $200 million increase. That does nothing to restore the 10% across the board cut. These are just built-in increases on top of that, meaning we'd have to spend at least $6.2 billion in fiscal year 2011 to provide the same level of services that we're trying to provide after the cuts, which means we're facing almost a $900 million spending gap. And how does it get to $1 billion? Rounding along with the governor has already proposed to restore $100 million of the school funding that was cut through that 10% across the board cut. So the challenges are deep. What it means is revenues would have to grow 16% in order to balance this budget on true revenue stream coming in the door. Let me tell you, in fiscal year 2008 and 2009, when the economy was much better, revenues, absent increasing your taxes and fees, only grew 3.7% in a 2-year period. No way that we're going to get to 16% revenue growth to get there. So the challenges are going to be really, really steep. Also, just giving you my contact information, website, and so forth. If you'd like a copy of these slides, they will be on they're already on my website. I did bring a few extra copies that I'll put at the back of the room if you'd like to pick one up. But as I said before, I have to give you some doom and gloom because that's the reality that we're facing. It is not going to be easy. But the key is we've got to start taking a longer-term look to Iowa's finances. What got us into this mess has been the short-term focus that our elected officials have had. We've put blinders on and we said, I'm going to balance this year's budget, but that's all I'm going to worry about. I'm not going to worry about the future. Well, we all know with our own personal finances, if we only considered the short term and ignored the long term, we would not make the best decisions with our own personal finances. And that's what's happening with Iowa's finances. We're not considering the long term, and we've made some decisions that have caused us, with this recession, to have many more challenges than what we should have had we controlled our stuff. So with that, I'll turn it over to Jim again and look forward to questions.